start with Christian. Can you give us a little background on the context? Who are the bottom of the pyramid and why are they important to the rest of us?
Yeah, absolutely, with pleasure. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Great pleasure to be with you. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Seems we have quite a few labs tonight. So, so I'm from the LSE's Innovation Lab. I was asked to very briefly give a bit of the context, I think, in terms of what the BOP, kind of to have a common denominator for what we talk about, and also going very briefly into the business model canvas, so that all of you here, can maybe also directly relate it to your organizations and how you can basically get the best out of the evening for yourselves. So basically, the LSE Innovation Lab is working with organizations in developing countries, particularly at the base of the pyramid, looking into how we can empower them to build sustainable business models, believing that building innovative business models is the most effective way to empower people on the ground. We do three things mainly. One is research, so we work with researchers at local universities in these contexts to create evidence-based knowledge. So knowledge which is going beyond anecdotal ideas, but rather seeing what are the success patterns, what are the failure patterns, and what can we learn in terms of comparing the different contexts. We are currently mapping that on an online map, where you can see the differences, and as entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs can see what works in your respective context. We're currently developing a mobile solution where, as a social entrepreneur in these contexts, you can then very simply go through several steps in terms of how to build the model. We're also doing teaching. We select from across the school master students who have previous experience in the field, then we train them in business modeling and then send them over to our partner organizations in developing countries. Very glad to see that some of our alumni are here, including Jamal, and some of our students. It's always great to see the kind of vivid passion. And also, third thing we're doing is workshops, usually pro bono on the ground with social entrepreneurs, to support them directly with their models, and particularly focus on the train-the-trainers model in terms of working with people who are usually multipliers in their respective communities. We focus mostly on Africa and Asia, and work with different multinationals, entrepreneurs, and social entrepreneurs. Those of you who are in these contexts, I guess quite a few of you might go back to your countries. We're always happy to see if there are ways we can support in terms of either evidence-based knowledge or working with you on the ground. So please do feel free to come afterwards. In terms of the context, what we talk about tonight, most of you might be very, very familiar with it, so I will cut that very, very short. But really, we talk about these around 4 billion people living at less than $2 purchasing power parity at kind of usually resource-constrained environments. It's the largest socioeconomic group in the world. And the BOP1, you just mentioned, Prahlad, was really this idea to see the poor no more as victims, but rather as consumers. So to understand it as a new market coming up, it is usually focusing on listening first and then developing products and services that cater to that market. And that was the old-fashioned model. It got a lot of critique because it's obviously looking at poor people more as consumers than as people who can actually create or can actually develop. So the BOP 2.0 then was to looking into how can we integrate the poor much better into value chains? How can we see how they could become producers? How can they co-develop solutions? And how can they be part of the value chain? So it became a dialogue from the rather listening to the dialogue. And the key challenge then became how can you co-create these different business models. And we've also worked, I think, with IBM a few years and other partners, particularly also seeing that multinationals who obviously have the resources on the ground to also bring them into that space. In terms of business modeling, which might be relevant for those of you who set something up, but it's also relevant for those of you who work in large organizations and want to do intrapreneurial work within organizations. Is a very similar logic. One thing I learned over the last 5 years from our anthropologists mostly was to not start with a solution, but to start with a problem. I think we management people usually jump into the field and say, okay, well, I have an idea and I solve it. The problem I see out there, but a lot of times the problems are multifaceted, right? It's a real context. A lot of times you have power dynamics and other things. Those of you interested in that, Julie, one of my colleagues, she's an anthropologist, and she's looking into how you have these social enterprises like Rickshaw Bank or others who on paper look really interesting. They do great jobs, empower people, but then the local mafia is basically having kind of the local rickshaw pullers become real problems afterwards. So what looks good on paper a lot of times in reality then becomes less effective. So basically, which means that before looking at the business model, we would suggest to first briefly go through a kind of change model where you think about what is the theory of change, what is the real issue on the ground, so what is the target group, what are their key constraints, what are the underlying paradigms, and then from there deriving the objectives and then the business model. In terms of the business model itself, that was the kind of key issue we wanted to include. What I always found interesting is that most people, when they think about innovation, they think in terms of products or services, right? They think, I have an idea for a product that makes the world better, or a service. But that is usually not the most exciting thing, right? The most exciting thing is to think about how can I create a new business model? So how can I create a new narrative and new systems and processes which enable us to work at much lower cost and to provide much better products, but to think more comprehensively about it. So what we talk about when we talk about business models is really a rationale of how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value. So what we really talk about is a coherent storyline about what we're doing, and usually a lot of people write that down in business plans. Then business plans obviously being living documents, so never in stone, but rather developing. I think there's a huge phantom discussion usually going around the kind of those entrepreneurs who say they had the idea in the shower and then developed it without a business plan versus the academics who say we need a business plan. I think the real solution is in the middle, saying the business plan usually forces you to collect your thoughts, it forces you to agree with your team members on the most crucial elements and to communicate it to stakeholders, but it's definitely not anything which is in stone. So when briefly talking about the different aspects of the business model, it's the example of Vision Spring, which is a social enterprise in India. Those of you who have social enterprises might be helpful to kind of relate it to your own organization. So what they said is, well, there's a real need or problem. I mean, the business model canvas. Who of you have Canvas? Who of you have heard of the business model canvas? Hands up. All right, that's a good start, so we can cut that really short. Okay, business model canvas is the idea that we try to map a business model in different elements, and then we try to understand how do these elements fit to each other. And so we have different elements such as value proposition, so what do we offer, revenue model, how do we make money out of it, key activities that are related to it, networks, customers, and so on. So based on that, Vision Spring says, well, we have a real problem here in India. We have 400 million people in India and other countries who develop a farsightedness. It's a term I can usually not pronounce, presbyopia. So they develop farsightedness when they get older. And usually the problem is that they don't have access to affordable eye care, because you either have those half-criminal market sellers who are trying to sell something which they have absolutely no clue about, or on the other hand side, absolutely expensive eye care. So they said, well, what we want to achieve is we want to empower people to see again, because that means that they can lead a much more productive life again. That means that they can live a dignified life. Because obviously, when you think about a person who can't really see, think about all the implications that has in terms of what you can do, how you are valued by others, and so on. So it means a lot usually to an individual. So what they said is, okay, well, we have a social value proposition. The social value proposition is we want to provide affordable access to eye care, and we want to sell reading glasses, which are usually costed at approximately $4. The key activities they do then is they provide these eyeglasses, including the training. So they take micro-entrepreneurs, train them how to very briefly examine people in terms of how they can, what eyeglasses they need, and then also providing them with the eyeglasses, so they create jobs for micro-entrepreneurs. And then these micro-entrepreneurs on the ground sell these businesses in a bag. The network partners are usually rural micro-entrepreneurs, so it's a network-based distribution. Those of you who want to venture in these POP contexts, you will see that a lot of times, I mean, Grameen pioneered that a few decades ago, this whole idea of how can you leverage networks that already exist versus coming from the outside and just kind of putting something in place. So usually what Vision Spring also does is trying to leverage local communities. In terms of revenue streams, they usually make their money via the packages. And the outcomes is usually that the people who receive it have an improved productivity, and also by that then can have a better working life, but also, again, it means a lot for themselves. Outcome is an interesting word because those of you who have followed the discussion a little bit, there's always this big theme about outputs versus outcomes, so that a lot of NGOs and organizations focus on outputs, so how many people did we educate, how many people did we channel through a certain program, but what does that really tell us, right? It's great that I trained 20 people, but what actually happens to these people? What is the real outcome? If I would look in 5 years, what did they actually do with this? And I think that is something where these ventures like Vision Spring do a relatively okay job in terms of trying to measure outcomes in that respect. Those of you who try to measure, we at the moment are collecting kind of a database of impact measurements, so very happy to support you with that. In terms of the process then, when talking about business model innovation, that usually then is the process of innovating the business model. And basically, I think the panel is too exciting to let it wait for much too longer, so I will be silent now. I think the last thing I wanted to bring across is what we believe are the success patterns in the BOP context. And so it is kind of both from what we've seen in previous studies and previous examples, but also what we've seen on the ground. So the one is really to leverage existing assets of marginalized groups. So not coming and thinking that you can do everything else better and that you have to do everything on your own, but rather going into local communities, understanding what skills are there already, what resources are there. I mean, a lot of human potential usually is there, a lot of social capital is there. So trying to understand how you can leverage these resources and build a kind of meaningful relationship on the ground. The second is leadership, so a real ability to bridge between stakeholder groups. What we've seen in some of our studies was actually that you usually have a charismatic leader coming in who builds local relationships, for example, by volunteering with local groups. So doing something which is absolutely not related to the core business, but understanding that real trust is built by first doing something for the community. Volunteering, renting land from the locals or something like that. So something which shows that you're a trustable person. And then afterwards building something around that. And usually then the second or third generation after these charismatic entrepreneurs forgets that. And a lot of times you see that then performance usually decreases because, again, it is all based on that trust you have with the local community. So this ability is absolutely key. One thing which then is very obvious, where IBM also plays a big role then, is kind of management system development, bringing in better technology solutions as well to really manage a growing organization. A lot of social entrepreneurs want to do it all at once and then fail at doing anything at all. So it's a lot about developing a certain technological capability as well to handle the data, to handle the actual things on the ground. And yeah, this is really the kind of to provide a bit of the context. And now I think we will have a very exciting panel around that. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.